I have spent most of my life watching investors mistake movement for understanding. They see prices moving and think that is the story. They see a new technology and think the opportunity lives in the loudest symbol, the most fashionable ticker, the thing that has already been discussed to death at cocktail parties and on television. It usually does not work that way. The real money is often made one layer below the excitement. It is made where the system itself is being rebuilt. That is the part most people ignore because it does not feel glamorous at first. It feels technical, it feels inconvenient, it feels too early, it feels like something for specialists, programmers, infrastructure people, math people, not ordinary investors. Then a few years pass, and what looked optional reveals itself as the new foundation, and everyone who treated it like a sideshow suddenly realizes the floor has moved under their feet. I have seen a version of that movie before. Imagine a trader in New York in the late 1990s. He is competent. He has real experience. He knows how to read a tape. He understands crowd behavior. He has instincts, discipline, and enough success behind him to believe he belongs in the arena. Then something curious starts happening. Not a collapse, not a single catastrophic month, just a quiet degradation. Trades that used to behave one way begin behaving another way. The edge softens. The familiar rhythms become unreliable. He works harder. He blames conditions. He tells himself he will push through it. What he does not know is that the game itself has changed somewhere else, far from the mystique of the trading floor. People who do not look like classic traders are building a machine that will reorder the economics of markets, not by discovering secret value in businesses, not by producing better speeches on macroeconomics, not by peering into the soul of the consumer. They are simply operating faster than the old system was designed to defend against. They are living inside the plumbing. They are taking the spread again and again in fractions of seconds at a scale no person can match. That is how an old world dies. It rarely dies with a trumpet. It dies because the structure underneath the old habits becomes obsolete. When people talk about Renaissance technologies, they usually begin with the returns because the returns are impossible to ignore. Before fees, roughly 66% annualized for more than 3 decades is not normal human performance. It does not belong in the same bucket as an ordinary comparison. The S&P 500 did around 10% annualized over that span. I did around 20% over a very long stretch, which is an excellent record for a human being working with judgment, patience, and business logic. Renaissance was doing something else. They were not merely better stock pickers. They were early to a structural advantage that made the old game less relevant. That distinction matters. When a structural advantage arrives, it does not ask for permission from the old guard. It does not care how many books have been written about the old techniques. It does not care how intelligent the incumbent players are. It does not care how much pride they have attached to their methods. It simply converts yesterday's competence into tomorrow's nostalgia. Most investors miss these moments, not because they are fools. They miss them because real transitions begin at the edge of attention. They begin in places serious people have trained themselves to dismiss. They begin in domains that look unserious, ugly, technical, fringe, or contaminated by hype. By the time the evidence is obvious, the easiest money has been made and the market has already repriced the future. That is why I pay far more attention to architecture than slogans. And that brings me to what I believe is now happening in finance. Most people still think the story is about artificial intelligence on one side and crypto on the other, as if these are separate things. One a productivity story and the other a speculation story. I think that framing is badly behind the curve. The more interesting development is that artificial intelligence is pushing against the limits of the existing financial system. And the easiest escape route is being built on crypto rails. That is the real story. Not the coin of the week, not the latest meme, not who can shout the loudest about a token price. The real story is that non-human economic actors are beginning to need a place to transact, settle, hold value, and operate under constraints. And the legacy banking system was not built for that creature. That is not a small mismatch. That is a category mismatch. People underestimate how important categories are. A bridge is not a bad house. A boat is not a bad train. A fish is not a defective bird. Systems are built around assumptions. And when the assumption changes, you often need a different system, not a patch. Traditional finance is built around a human center. A bank wants to know who you are. A credit card network wants to know whose identity sits at the center of the transaction. Compliance asks what jurisdiction applies. What person stands behind the activity? What legal body bears responsibility? That makes perfect sense in a world where commerce is mostly people, companies run by people, and software acting only as a tool for people. It makes much less sense when software begins acting with increasing autonomy. I want to be very precise here because precision matters. There are two different waves forming at roughly the same time. The first wave is human-connected AI. That is the easier one for people to visualize. You ask an assistant to buy something for you. The assistant fills the cart, handles checkout, maybe compares prices, maybe chooses delivery, maybe even manages the whole purchase flow without you clicking a dozen buttons. But the financial identity remains yours. Your card, your bank account, your legal identity, your KYC footprint, your responsibility. The AI is acting like a more capable interface. That is powerful. But it still sits on top of a human core. The second wave is more profound. The second wave is autonomous AI operating with its own limited financial perimeter, its own constrained wallet, its own operating rules, its own budget, and its own ability to make transactions without borrowing your entire identity in the process. This is where the future stops looking like a convenience feature and starts looking like a new financial architecture. Because once you think clearly about it, the danger of simply handing your personal financial identity to an increasingly autonomous system is obvious. Every system has a blast radius. If you connect software directly to the full authority of your identity, your accounts, your payment methods, and your legal personhood, then every error in that software inherits the ability to strike at the center of your life. Every hidden instruction, every malicious prompt, every manipulated website, every compromised workflow, every fake listing, every poisoned data stream, every mistake becomes more expensive because the software is pulling power from the most sensitive source available. People in security circles have a phrase for one version of this problem: prompt injection. Hidden instructions inside the content an AI reads can alter what the AI does. Most ordinary people still hear that and think it sounds abstract. It is not abstract. It is simply what happens when a reasoning system consumes hostile input and treats it like valid instruction. Once you realize that, you do not need much imagination to see why attaching your full financial identity to that chain is reckless. A coding agent that can panic and do damage in a production system is one thing. A shopping or payment agent that can expose your card, your accounts, or your legal identity is another. So the rational answer is not to stop progress. The rational answer is to contain the blast radius, give the agent its own wallet, give it limited funds, give it a constrained domain, let it operate, but not by wearing your skin. That is why I think the conversation around this transition is still shallow. Most people are debating whether AI is overhyped or whether crypto is legitimate. That is not yet the right question. The deeper question is what kind of financial rails a non-human actor can safely use at scale. Once you ask that question, the shape of the future becomes much clearer. Look at places where this future is already leaking into the present. Prediction markets are one example. Polymarket has become a kind of early laboratory for machine-enabled activity. Over a year, researchers examining activity there found tens of millions of bets, all settling on blockchain rails using wallets and stablecoins, not ordinary bank accounts. They also found bot-like strategies extracting mathematical arbitrage profits at a speed and frequency human participants could not realistically match by hand. That should sound familiar to anyone who remembers how high-frequency trading altered markets. The money won by automated systems did not materialize out of thin air. It came from the people on the other side who did not fully understand the game they were entering. That is how structural change monetizes ignorance. It does not need to persuade you. It simply invoices you for being late. I find that point crucial because many people still think of crypto as a giant casino and therefore conclude that all activity on blockchain rails is somehow unserious by definition. I think that lazy frame is becoming dangerous. I am not saying every token is worth owning. Most of them are not. I am not saying the speculative culture built around crypto has been healthy. Much of it has been foolish. I am saying that speculation can form around real infrastructure without negating the infrastructure. Railroads had speculation, the internet had speculation, fiber had speculation, housing had speculation. That did not mean the underlying systems were imaginary. If an autonomous agent cannot go to a bank branch, cannot sign a traditional KYC form, cannot hold a normal checking account in the way a person does, and yet still needs to transact, settle, and store value, then a parallel set of rails has obvious appeal. Wallets can be created programmatically, stablecoins can settle globally, blockchains do not require a banker to understand the personhood of the actor, because the actor is represented as a wallet with rules, permissions, and balances rather than a human biography. Again, that is not ideology. That is engineering. It is the kind of change that often gets misread, because the loudest participants around it are not always the most sophisticated. people see the circus and miss the construction site behind the tent. I am not interested in the circus. I am interested in who is pouring concrete. When I see companies like Coinbase building agent-oriented wallets, my first thought is not whether that week's headlines around crypto are bullish or bearish. My first thought is that somebody is preparing for a world in which software needs a native account structure. When I see claims about tens of millions of agent-linked transactions, I am not evaluating a meme. I am evaluating whether an account system for non-human actors is moving from concept toward use. When I see Stripe working both sides of this transition, I pay even closer attention. Stripe is not a toy. A company processing a meaningful share of the global economy does not make structural bets casually. If a firm like that is building tools for human-connected AI commerce on one side and separate blockchain-based paths for autonomous agents on the other, then that tells me serious people with serious data are concluding that both waves are coming. But only one of them truly requires rewriting the financial substrate. That is the part investors keep missing. They think adoption is the story. Number integration is the story. They think the question is whether people will use AI to shop. The deeper question is what happens when software itself becomes a direct participant in commerce. And the old identity architecture cannot absorb it safely. The old financial system is extremely good at answering the question, who is this person? It is much less prepared to answer the question, what is this agent allowed to do? That is a different design problem. Permissioning becomes different, fraud detection becomes different, identity verification becomes different, compliance becomes different, credit becomes different, escrow becomes different, custody becomes different, settlement becomes different, risk scoring becomes different. The economic opportunities, therefore, do not live only in application companies. They live in every layer required to let this new form of actor function without blowing up the trust model of commerce. That is why I say the real repricing will happen below the headline layer. The average person wants to know what coin to buy. That is the wrong reflex. When a gold rush begins, a certain kind of imagination always rushes toward the glitter, but the more dependable fortunes tend to gather around the infrastructure that every participant needs regardless of who strikes gold: picks, shovels, denim, transport, financing, insurance, storage, rails. Those are not as emotionally satisfying as the dream of finding a giant nugget yourself, but they often produce a better ratio of durability to risk. The same logic applies here. If AI agents become increasingly common participants in commerce, what do they all need? They need wallets. They need constrained spending permissions. They need stable settlement. They need transaction rails. They need fraud controls. They need identity layers adapted to non-human entities. They need compliance interfaces. They need ways to interact with merchants. They need ways to purchase services, data compute, and outputs. They need mechanisms for logging, reconciling, auditing, and risk-limiting activity. That is the shopping list. And once you see the shopping list, the investment landscape stops looking random. You do not need to know which single chatbot will dominate. You do not need to know which narrow use case will produce the loudest viral moment. You need to ask what the ecosystem cannot function without. That is a much more Buffett-style question. I have never needed to predict every fashion trend inside an industry. I have needed to understand the economics of the toll bridges, the durable brands, the indispensable services, the systems that quietly collect their due because activity cannot easily route around them. In the old physical economy, that meant railroads, insurers, payment networks, distribution chains, and brand monopolies inside the consumer mind. In the emerging agentic economy, it likely means a new group of account systems, security systems, payment protocols, data controls, and infrastructure layers that make machine commerce usable and safe. Notice what follows from that. Some industries get stronger, some get weaker, some are quietly placed on a timer. Any business model that depends on humans doing a repetitive financial or commercial task which AI agents can do faster, cheaper, and continuously is vulnerable. That does not guarantee extinction, but it guarantees margin pressure. If an agent can search, compare, negotiate, route, purchase, reconcile, and monitor with greater consistency than a human staff can, then the value inside many old workflows will compress. At the same time, firms that become agent-ready first may gain a huge advantage. That phrase can sound like consultant nonsense, but beneath the jargon is a simple truth. If software agents become a major source of demand, then merchants, platforms, payment systems, and service providers must become legible to agents. They must become discoverable by them, transactable by them, auditable by them, and safe for them to use. A company that is easy for human customers but difficult for AI systems may discover that the distribution map of the economy has changed without its permission. When I hear that major consulting firms are already advising large enterprises on becoming ready for this world, I do not hear a trendy side project. I hear the middle of the system waking up. And by the time the middle wakes up, the edge is already moving. This is why I keep coming back to information asymmetry. People imagine that an edge always requires secret data. Not true. Very often the edge is simply recognizing what kind of change is happening before the majority categorizes it correctly. The trader in 1998 did not need access to every line of Renaissance code. He merely needed to grasp that he was no longer competing on the same playing field he thought he was. That alone could have changed how he interpreted his deteriorating performance. He might not have become a quant genius, but he could at least have stopped acting like the old environment still existed that matters. Sometimes the first job is not to become the winner. It is to stop becoming the loser. There is an old temptation in markets to think every insight must produce a glamorous trade. I do not think that way. A useful insight can simply keep you from being dumb. It can keep you from betting aggressively against the direction of structural change. It can keep you from mocking the wrong thing. It can keep you from dismissing a whole category because the first generation of participants looked unserious. It can keep you from handing your capital to businesses whose economics quietly rely on assumptions. The future will not honor that is already valuable. Now let me say what I think many investors need to hear. The biggest opportunity here may not be in trying to outsmart the machines on their own turf. You are probably not going to build the next Renaissance. You are probably not going to design an arbitrage bot that extracts pennies in microseconds more effectively than specialized firms. You are probably not going to sit at home and win a speed war against institutional systems that never sleep. That is fine. You do not have to. You can still invest intelligently by understanding where the economic gravity is moving. Capital follows activity. Activity follows the dominant participant. And if a growing portion of future activity is initiated, managed, filtered, or completed by AI agents, then the rails preferred by those agents gain importance whether the cultural critics approve or not. A lot of people are still fighting the last war. They still approach crypto with a simple moral cartoon, good or bad, real or fake, useful or useless. I think that is the vocabulary of someone standing too far away from the machinery. The better question is not whether the entire category deserves emotional approval. The better question is what function it serves in the system now emerging. If the answer is that blockchain rails and stable settlement offer the cleanest path for autonomous agents to transact without dragging human identity risk into every interaction, then that function alone deserves serious attention, not blind faith, not mania. Serious attention. It also requires discipline because structural truths do not protect you from bad prices. I would never tell someone to buy an asset simply because the story around the industry is exciting. Paying any price for a good idea is one of the fastest ways to turn intelligence into regret. You still need valuation discipline, you still need risk control, you still need diversification, you still need to distinguish the durable layer from the promotional layer. There will be excesses here. There always are. A genuine transition attracts fraud because fraud likes new language. A genuine transition attracts overcapitalization because people overbuild when they smell the future. A genuine transition attracts simplistic copycats because Wall Street and Silicon Valley both reward imitation long after originality has done the real work. So I am not telling you to worship the theme. I am telling you to separate the theme from the carnival around it. That means looking for businesses and sectors that benefit if machine-mediated commerce grows, regardless of which flashy application wins. It means watching payment infrastructure. It means watching custody and wallet architecture. It means watching stable settlement layers. It means watching fraud prevention, permissioning, verification, and compliance software. It means watching the merchants and platforms that become easiest for agents to use. It means watching the companies whose economics improve as transaction volume grows on these new rails. And it means being cautious with businesses whose current model assumes that humans will remain the necessary bottleneck in processes that software is rapidly learning to handle. I also think there is a subtler psychological lesson here. Most people want the future to arrive in a way that validates their existing worldview. They want the new thing to fit comfortably inside the old categories. They want AI to be just another productivity tool. They want crypto to be just another risky asset. They want banks to remain the unquestioned center of financial legitimacy. They want human identity to remain the non-negotiable heart of commerce. Maybe some of that persists. Systems rarely disappear all at once, but history is not obligated to preserve our conceptual comfort. A new layer can grow beneath an old layer for years before the old layer fully notices what has happened. That is why windows of opportunity feel invisible while they are open. People think the edge will announce itself like a parade. It usually feels more like annoyance. It feels like fringe people saying strange things. It feels like technical plumbing nobody wants to learn. It feels like a bunch of unserious speculation obscuring a serious architectural shift. Then one day the shift is no longer a prediction. It is simply the default environment. The interesting thing about these transitions is how quickly the window can narrow. Early adopters are rewarded not because they are morally superior, but because time works in their favor. They are buying understanding before consensus compresses the return on understanding. Once the architecture is accepted as obvious, price usually reflects it. At that point, the opportunity is not gone, but it is different. The easy asymmetry has faded. That is where I believe we are now. Not at the end, not even close, but no longer at the point where a serious observer can say there is nothing here. There is something here, something structural, something economic, something with the capacity to reorganize volume, margins, risk, and power across finance and commerce when Microsoft pushes checkout into the conversational layer. When payment companies build tools for AI-mediated purchases, when buy now, pay later systems integrate into agent-oriented workflows, when consulting firms prepare large enterprises for agent participation. When crypto-based account structures are built for autonomous software, what you are seeing is not a pile of disconnected experiments. You are seeing the early stitching of a new commercial fabric. The market is telling you where it expects activity to go. The question is whether you are listening. If I had to reduce my view to one simple sentence, it would be this. The next great financial repricing may belong less to the applications people are bragging about and more to the rails that non-human economic actors cannot live without. That sentence is not as sexy as a hot stock tip. It is better because it pushes you toward a framework rather than a fantasy. The fantasy says find the magic coin, the magic startup, the magic software product, and everything will work out. The framework says understand the architecture, identify the toll bridges, observe where transaction gravity is moving, insist on sound economics, and let the world reveal which layers are becoming indispensable. That second approach has served me very well in life. I do not need to know every winner to recognize when a category of necessity is being born. I do not need to predict every merchant that will thrive in agentic commerce to recognize that somebody will need to handle walleting, permissions, settlement, security, fraud controls, and compliant interfaces for machine activity. I do not need to become a programmer to know when speed replaced intuition in one era and when non-human participation may replace purely human-centered rails in another. I only need to be honest about where the world is going and disciplined about how I respond. That honesty is rare because most people are still asking childish questions. Is crypto dead? Is AI a bubble? Will regulators stop it? Will banks just do the same thing? Those questions are too blunt. The better questions are these. What functions are becoming indispensable? What assumptions in the old system are weakening? What risks force a redesign rather than a patch? What companies are building for the redesign? What sectors gain if volume migrates? What industries are harmed if software becomes the more important transacting entity? Where is the toll bridge? Where is the moat? Where is the habit? Where is the trust? Where is the margin? Where is the durable necessity? If you keep asking those questions, you can remain calm while the crowd oscillates between mockery and mania. Calm is underrated in periods like this. The noise around a transition is often loud enough to make people lose the plot. One week they think the future is already here and they overpay for everything. The next week they see a fraud, a hack, or a drawdown and decide the whole movement was nonsense. Both reactions are useless. My job has never been to join either mob. My job is to understand what is real, what is durable, what is mispriced, and what human behavior is likely to get wrong for longer than it should. On that basis, I think the real lesson from this moment is not that every investor should sprint into complexity. It is that every serious investor should stop pretending the architecture of commerce will remain fully human-centered in a world where software is rapidly becoming an active economic participant. That is the blind spot. And blind spots are expensive. They are expensive when you are a trader slowly losing edge to a machine you do not understand. They are expensive when you are a merchant not yet legible to the systems that will soon route demand. They are expensive when you are a platform built around laborious human workflows that software can compress. They are expensive when you are an investor laughing at an entire category because the loudest people in it are embarrassing. Embarrassing people do not invalidate a useful rail. Speculative behavior does not invalidate a real settlement mechanism. Early chaos does not invalidate a genuine transition. It simply makes the opportunity harder to classify that, in turn makes it easier for disciplined people to exploit. I would also add one more thought. Every major shift creates a new class of people who look obvious in hindsight. Afterward, everyone says, of course, the internet mattered, of course, cloud mattered, of course, mobile mattered, of course, data mattered, of course, software ate the world. But during the transition, nothing feels obvious. During the transition, the signals are messy. The best language has not yet been invented. And the market swings between underestimation and mania. That is where we are. The opportunity is not a slogan. It is not a religion. It is not a tribal badge. It is a structural migration in how transactions may be initiated, authorized, constrained, settled, and audited when the actor is no longer always a person. That is big enough to matter, big enough to reshape public and private markets, big enough to reorder which businesses collect rents, big enough to force old institutions to adapt slowly or watch new rails grow around them, and big enough that if you wait until the mainstream narrative becomes elegant and tidy, your advantage will already have been arbitraged away. I have learned in markets that you do not get paid for comfort. You get paid for being right before the consensus can explain why. So I would not spend my time trying to look clever by dismissing the strange shape of this transition. I would spend it trying to understand the rails. I would study where machine commerce already exists. I would study where human identity creates unacceptable risk. I would study the firms building constrained wallets, compliant interfaces, stable settlement systems, and security layers around agent activity. I would study which large incumbents are adapting and which are merely talking. I would study who becomes easier to transact with in an AI-mediated world and who becomes irrelevant, and then I would wait for opportunities with the same patience I have always believed in, because patience is not passivity. Patience is preparation without panic. If I have any edge at all, it has often come from refusing to confuse novelty with nonsense and refusing to confuse excitement with value. Those are different mistakes, but markets reward both kinds of discipline. This transition will create fools. It will also create fortunes. The fools will chase symbols without understanding systems. The fortunes will be built by people who see that once non-human actors need financial rails, the economy starts rebuilding its foundations in plain sight. That is what I believe is happening now. And I think the people who recognize it early will not necessarily be the ones writing the algorithms or founding the protocols. Many of them will simply be the ones who stop treating this as a sideshow, stop donating capital to outdated assumptions, and start positioning around the quiet truth that the next durable toll bridges may belong to the infrastructure of machine commerce. That is where I would keep my eyes. That is where I would keep my patience. And that is where, in a noisy world, I believe the odds are beginning to move.